What if the oldest written records in human history weren't simply documenting daily life, but preserving memory of something that descended from the sky? What if the gods the Sumerians carved into clay weren't metaphors for natural forces, but descriptions of something they actually witnessed? Something that came down and taught them to build, to write, to measure the heavens with startling precision. In the desert of southern Iraq, in cities buried beneath millennia of wind-blown sand, archaeologists uncovered tablets that shouldn't exist. Writing that appeared suddenly, fully formed. Knowledge that seemed to arrive all at once, without the slow development you'd expect from early civilization. And pressed into that ancient clay, again and again, descriptions of beings who came from the sky, who brought the arts of civilization down from the heavens, who walked among humans and then returned to the stars. So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that make you question everything we think we know about our beginnings. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient mystery stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we're going back to the very beginning, to the moment when civilization seemed to ignite across Mesopotamia like a sudden flame. We're going to examine the tablets themselves, the actual words pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, and ask a question that archaeology has never quite answered. Why do the Sumerians describe their knowledge as a gift from the sky? And what exactly were they trying to tell us? When Austin Henry Layard first broke through the walls of ancient Nineveh in 1845, he expected treasures of gold and jewels, the usual spoils of archaeological triumph. What he found instead was something far stranger, far more valuable, and far more unsettling. Room after room filled with clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, baked hard by the fire that had consumed the palace of Ashurbanipal 26 centuries before. The tablets were covered in wedge-shaped marks that no one alive could read, a language lost to time, pressed into mud by hands that had turned to dust millennia ago. But it was what those tablets said, once scholars finally broke the code, that made the archaeological world go silent with wonder and confusion. Picture the scene. Layard standing in the ruins of what had been the greatest library of the ancient world. Dust thick in the air, the afternoon sun of northern Iraq slanting through gaps in collapsed masonry. Around him, his workers were uncovering fragments of baked clay, each one covered in precise rows of wedge-shaped impressions. They had no idea what they were looking at. No one in the modern world had seen cuneiform writing in nearly 2,000 years. The script had died with the civilizations that used it, replaced by Aramaic, then Greek, then Arabic, until the very memory of how to read these marks had vanished from human knowledge. Layard shipped the tablets back to the British Museum in crates, thousands upon thousands of them, fragments of a civilization that predated Rome by millennia, that had flourished and fallen before Athens was even imagined. For years they sat in storage, catalogued but unreadable, archaeological curiosities waiting for someone to crack the code. That breakthrough came slowly, painfully, through the work of scholars like Henry Rawlinson, who spent years copying inscriptions from a cliff face at Behistun in Persia, matching old Persian text against unknown scripts until patterns emerged, until the wedge-shaped marks began to resolve into words, into grammar, into stories, and then the tablets began to speak. what emerged from the translation work was a civilization more sophisticated than anyone had imagined possible for people living 5,000 years ago. The library at Nineveh contained mathematical tables, astronomical charts, medical texts, legal codes, epic poetry, historical records, and religious documents describing gods who came from the sky and taught humanity the arts of civilization. The library's contents spanned centuries, copied and recopied by generations of scribes, some tablets originating from sources 1,000 years older than Ashurbanipal's palace. The Assyrians, it turned out, were archivists as much as conquerors, preserving knowledge from the Babylonians, who had preserved it from the Akkadians, who had learned it from the Sumerians, the mysterious people who had invented writing itself in the marshes of southern Mesopotamia. But it was the nature of some of those texts that troubled the translators, that made them pause in their work and wonder what exactly they were reading. Because mixed among the mundane documents of daily administration and commerce were tablets describing things that shouldn't exist in texts so ancient. Complex astronomical calculations, mathematical concepts that wouldn't be rediscovered until the Renaissance, and descriptions again and again of beings from the sky who had brought all this knowledge down to earth, who had walked among humans and taught them to build cities and write their names in clay. The discovery at Nineveh was only the beginning. Other excavations followed, at Babylon, at at sites scattered across Iraq and Syria and Turkey. Each dig uncovered more tablets, more libraries, more fragments of a civilization that had dominated the ancient world for 3,000 years, and then vanished so completely that even the Greeks barely remembered its name. And the more tablets that were translated, the more consistent the story became. The Mesopotamians believed their civilization had been given to them, taught to them, by beings they called the Anunnaki, who descended from heaven and established the arts of life among humanity. Among the thousands of tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, one text stands apart for its sheer strangeness, for the way it defies everything we understand about early human civilization. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BCE from sources far older, begins with a sentence that has troubled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Not when humans first gathered, or when the first leaders emerged, but descended from heaven. As if kingship, the very concept of organized rule, came from somewhere else, somewhere above. And then the list does something even stranger. The tablet, known to scholars as WB 444, sits now in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, a fragment of baked clay covered in neat columns of cuneiform script. Other copies exist at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, in the Louvre, in private collections, because the king list was important enough that ancient scribes made multiple versions, preserving it across centuries. Each copy shows slight variations, scribal errors accumulated over generations of copying, but the core content remains remarkably consistent. The list names every king who ruled Sumerian cities from the beginning of kingship until the reign of Sin-Magir, king of Ezine, around 1827 BCE. It documents which cities held power during which periods. It records how long each king reigned. It provides the kind of detailed chronological information that historians dream of finding. Except for one problem. The numbers don't make sense. The reigns attributed to the earliest kings span tens of thousands of years. The later kings have normal human lifespans, but the first rulers, the kings who lived before a great flood swept across the land, reigned for periods that stretch beyond any rational possibility. Modern scholars have developed elaborate explanations for these impossible numbers. Perhaps they're symbolic, encoding some other kind of information in numerical form. Perhaps they're the result of calculating time differently, using lunar months instead of solar years, though even that doesn't quite resolve the problem. Perhaps they represent dynasties rather than individual rulers, though the text clearly presents them as sequential kings, each named individual passing the throne to the next. But here's what makes the king list truly unsettling. The Sumerians themselves never indicate they considered these numbers anything but literal historical fact. The text transitions seamlessly from antediluvian kings with impossibly long reigns to post-flood kings with normal lifespans, with no change in tone, no shift in language, no indication that the first section is mythological while the second is historical. To the ancient scribes who copied this text generation after generation, it was all one continuous history, stretching back to the moment when kingship first descended from heaven to the city of Eridu. The king list divides Sumerian history into two distinct periods, before the flood and after the flood. The kings who ruled after the flood had normal reigns, 20 years, 40 years, occasionally a century. But the kings who ruled before the flood reigned for spans that make no rational sense. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 28,800 years. His successor, Alalgar, for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, their combined reigns spanning 241,200 years. Modern scholars call these numbers symbolic, mythological, not meant to be taken literally. But the Sumerians didn't separate their king lists into categories of real and mythological. To them, it was all history, all one continuous record stretching back to when the gods walked the earth. Consider the precision with which these numbers are recorded. This isn't vague mythological time. In the days of old, or when the world was young. These are specific figures. 28,800 years, not 30,000, not approximately 30 millennia, but 28,800. The exactness suggests the Sumerians believed they were recording actual chronological information, preserving the reign lengths of rulers who had truly existed, even if those reign lengths defied human biology as we understand it. Some scholars have suggested the numbers encode astronomical cycles, that the Sumerians were tracking celestial movements and attributing them to royal reigns. Others propose the figures represent clan genealogies compressed into individual names. But none of these explanations quite accounts for why the Sumerians would structure their foundational historical document around such encoded information, presenting it as straightforward chronicle. And then there's the flood itself, the dividing line between the impossible past and the more comprehensible present. The king list states this simply, matter-of-factly. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The flood is presented as a historical event, a moment when civilization was destroyed and then restored, when kingship once again descended from heaven to establish order among the survivors. This same flood appears in numerous Mesopotamian texts, always described with similar language. A catastrophic deluge that nearly ended humanity, survived by one man warned in advance by the gods, who preserved human and animal life in a massive boat. The kings who ruled after this flood had reigns that make sense by human standards. Jusha of Kish reigned 600 years, still impossibly long by our biology, but at least within the realm of exaggerated human lifespan. His successors' reigns grow progressively shorter, approaching normal human spans as the list moves forward through time. By the time we reach the historical period that can be verified, through other archaeological evidence, the reign lengths match what we know from other sources. The king list transitions from myth to verifiable history so gradually, so seamlessly, that it becomes impossible to draw a clear line between legend and fact. To the Sumerians, it was all fact, all history, all true record of rulers who had lived and died from the dawn of kingship when it first descended from heaven, through the flood that nearly destroyed everything, to the historical kings whose palaces archaeologists could excavate and whose inscriptions could be found on temple walls. They appear in nearly every Sumerian text of significance, these beings called the Anunnaki, and their name offers the first clue to their mystery. Anu was the sky god, the highest of the high, dwelling in heaven beyond human reach. Ki meant earth, the realm of mortal existence. And so the Anunnaki, literally translated, means those who came from heaven to earth, the offspring of heaven and earth, beings who existed in both realms and moved between them. The texts describe them with startling consistency. They were powerful beyond human measure. They possessed knowledge humans didn't have. They made decisions about humanity's fate, and most importantly, they were not abstractions or distant cosmic forces. The Anunnaki had a physical presence. They interacted with humans. They built cities. They taught skills. And according to the tablets, they descended from the sky. The word appears hundreds of times across thousands of tablets, spanning 2 millennia of Mesopotamian literature. In some contexts, the Anunnaki seem to function as lesser gods, a divine assembly that gathers to make decisions about cosmic and earthly affairs. In others, they're described as judges of the underworld, determining the fate of the dead. But in the earliest Sumerian texts, the most ancient layers of mythology, the Anunnaki are consistently portrayed as beings who came to Earth with purpose, who brought knowledge and civilization, who existed in physical form and moved between the heavenly realm and the earthly plane. One tablet, discovered at the ancient city of Nippur and now residing in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes a gathering of the Anunnaki where they debate the fate of humanity. The text presents this council with remarkable specificity. The number of Anunnaki present, their individual votes, their disagreements about whether humans should be preserved or destroyed. These aren't vague divine forces, but distinct individuals with agency, opinions, conflicts. Another text describes how the Anunnaki divided up earthly responsibilities among themselves, each taking charge of specific aspects of civilization: agriculture, metallurgy, writing, law, irrigation, temple construction. The precision suggests the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki as something more concrete than purely symbolic representations of natural forces. Modern religious scholars interpret the Anunnaki as obvious mythological constructs, humanity's ancient attempt to explain natural phenomena through anthropomorphized gods. The sky becomes Anu, the earth becomes Kai, and their offspring become the various forces of nature given divine personality. This interpretation is reasonable, perhaps even probable. Every culture creates gods to explain their world, but the Sumerian descriptions of the Anunnaki include details that don't quite fit comfortable mythological categories. The texts describe the Anunnaki as physically different from humans, taller, more powerful, longer lived. They describe the Anunnaki as possessing specific knowledge that they deliberately taught to humanity. mathematical principles, astronomical observations, agricultural techniques, metallurgical processes. They describe the Anunnaki not as eternal divine essences, but as beings who arrived at a specific moment in time and who, in some texts, eventually departed again. What made the Anunnaki so central to Sumerian thought? Why did text after text, century after century, return to these beings and their descent from heaven? These Sumerians could have explained their civilization through any mythology they chose. They could have said humans slowly developed culture through their own effort. They could have attributed their knowledge to wise ancestors or legendary heroes. Instead, they consistently, persistently, across thousands of tablets and hundreds of years, credited the Anunnaki with bringing civilization from the sky, with teaching rather than inspiring, with direct intervention rather than distant blessing. If any figure in Sumerian mythology embodies the mystery of knowledge arriving from beyond human origin, it's Enki, the god who came up from the deep, who brought wisdom from the Abzu, the cosmic realm beneath the earth and beyond the sky. The texts describe him as the craftsman god, the shaper of civilization, the one who taught humans to farm, to build, to write, to organize cities and laws. But they also describe him arriving, not evolving from human imagination, not growing naturally from worship of rivers or fertility. Enki came from somewhere else, bearing gifts of knowledge that transformed scattered hunter-gatherers into the world's first civilization almost overnight, in archaeological terms. The tablets in the British Museum, the Louvre, the Oriental Institute, they all tell the same story. Before Enki, humans wandered. After Enki, humans built ziggurats and wrote epics and calculated the movement of planets. His temple at Eridu, excavated by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s and 1930s, revealed 17 successive building levels, each temple constructed directly atop the ruins of the last, stretching back to the dawn of Sumerian civilization around 5400 BCE. The earliest level was a simple reed shrine, barely more than a hut. But even that most ancient structure incorporated ritual elements that would persist for millennia. An offering table facing the entrance, a niche for a cult statue, and most tellingly, vessels of fresh water placed in the foundations, an offering to the Abzu, the deep watery realm from which Enki had emerged to bring wisdom to humanity. The Abzu itself is a strange concept in Sumerian cosmology, neither purely physical nor purely mythological. In some texts, it's the sweetwater aquifer beneath the earth, the source of springs and rivers that made Mesopotamian agriculture possible. In others, it's a cosmic ocean surrounding and underlying the world, the primordial waters from which creation emerged. But in texts specifically about Enki, the Abzu takes on characteristics that defy simple interpretation. It's described as Enki's dwelling place, a realm of profound wisdom and knowledge, containing secrets of creation, formulas of civilization, the fundamental patterns that shape reality. Enki descended from this deep place, or rose from it, depending on how you interpret the Sumerian prepositions, bringing knowledge that transformed human existence. The myths describe Enki's gifts in detail that seems almost technical. He taught humans to channel water through irrigation canals, creating agriculture that could support cities. He showed them how to work metal, transforming ore into tools and weapons that changed the possibilities of human life. He gave them writing, the revolutionary technology that allowed knowledge to persist across generations, that made civilization cumulative rather than cyclical. He established the me, those divine decrees or fundamental principles that governed everything from kingship to music to the proper conduct of religious rituals. All of this, the texts insist, came from Enki, who possessed it before humans did, who brought it from the Abzu and gifted it to humanity with deliberate intent. What archaeology shows is that these developments, irrigation agriculture, metallurgy, writing, urban organization, did indeed appear in southern Mesopotamia with remarkable speed. The transition from scattered farming villages to true cities with monumental architecture, specialized crafts and administrative complexity happened over just a few centuries, practically overnight in archaeological timescales. By 3200 BCE, Uruk covered nearly 600 acres and held perhaps 50,000 people, a population density that required sophisticated agricultural surplus, coordinated labour and administrative systems to function. The Sumerians credited this sudden flowering of civilization to Enki, and they preserved that credit in text after text, generation after generation, as if the origin story mattered desperately, as if future generations needed to remember that their knowledge had come from beyond themselves, from a being who descended from the deep bearing gifts that made them more than wandering tribes, scratching survival from the marshlands. The Sumerians themselves believed their civilization began in one specific place, at one specific moment, in a city that still lies buried beneath Iraqi desert sand. Eridu, they wrote, was the first city, the place where kingship first descended from heaven, where Enki first established his temple, where the boundary between divine realm and human world first became permeable. Modern archaeology confirms Eridu's extraordinary age, occupation layers reaching back to 5400 BCE, making it one of the oldest urban centres ever discovered. But it's what the tablets say about Eridu's founding that makes you pause in the museum reading rooms, makes you wonder what memory those ancient scribes were trying to preserve. The site sits about 22 kilometres southwest of Ur, in what is now barren desert but was once, thousands of years ago, a thriving coastal settlement where the Euphrates River met the Persian Gulf. The coastline has shifted over millennia, the gulf receding southward as silt from the rivers gradually extended the land. But in Sumerian times, Eridu stood at the water's edge, where fresh river water mixed with salt sea, where fish were abundant and trade routes converged. The Sumerians called it the first city, not just the oldest of their cities, but the first city in the world, the place where urban civilization began, where humans first learned to live in permanent settlements, with temples and organized labor and specialized crafts. When Leonard Woolley excavated Eridu in the 1930s, he found those 17 successive temple levels we mentioned, each built directly atop the ruins of the last, creating a tell, an artificial hill composed entirely of collapsed architecture rebuilt again and again over millennia. The deepest level, the oldest foundation, was a simple structure of reeds and mud brick, barely 3 meters on a side, but it already possessed the ritual elements that would define Mesopotamian temples for the next 3,000 years. Even at that most ancient level, the builders knew exactly what a temple should look like, how it should be oriented, what sacred geography it should embody. It's as if the template for religious architecture arrived fully formed, was implemented from the very beginning. But the tablets speak of Eridu's founding in language that goes beyond archaeology, beyond material culture. They describe Enki descending to Eridu from the Abzu, establishing his temple as the connection point between the watery deep and the surface world, creating a permanent portal through which divine wisdom could flow to humanity. Multiple texts call Eridu the seat of Enki, the place where he dwelt on earth, where he maintained his presence among humans. One tablet states that Eridu was built before the flood, that it was the first of 5 cities established before the great deluge swept over the land, and that after the flood, kingship descended from heaven specifically to Eridu before spreading to other Sumerian cities. The Sumerian word for Eridu, Nunki, carries its own mystery. Nun means mighty or princely, and Ka means place or earth. But Nun also has connotations of the primordial, the original, the first. Eridu was the mighty place, the princely earth, the first foundation where the divine touched the terrestrial. The Sumerians returned to Eridu in their texts again and again, always with reverence, always emphasizing its primacy, its role as the origin point. Even after the city declined in political importance, even after other cities grew larger and more powerful, Eridu retained its status as the sacred first city, the place where it all began. And what began there, according to the tablets, wasn't just a settlement or a temple, but a fundamental change in the human condition. Before Eridu, humans were scattered, living in small groups without permanent architecture or organized society. After Eridu, after Enki established his temple there and began teaching the arts of civilization, humans built cities, developed writing, practiced agriculture on a scale that could support thousands, created art and music and literature. The transformation happened, in archaeological terms, with stunning rapidity. The gap between simple farming villages and true urban civilization is measured in just a few centuries, and the Sumerians themselves traced that transformation to a specific moment, a specific place, Eridu, where the gods first touched earth, and where knowledge descended from heaven to change everything. Among the most mysterious concepts in Sumerian theology is the me, and the very difficulty of translating this word into English suggests we're dealing with something our modern worldview doesn't quite have room for. The me were divine decrees, fundamental principles, tools of civilization, powers that made culture possible. The tablets list over 100 of them: kingship, priesthood, metalworking, writing, music, architecture, law, mathematics, medicine. But here's what makes them strange. The me weren't invented by humans. They existed before humanity, held by the gods, specifically by Enki in his temple in Eridu. And according to the myths, there was a moment when these decrees, these fundamental tools of civilization, were transferred from the divine realm to the human world, a moment of contact when knowledge flowed from sky to earth. Scholars have struggled for over a century to define what the me actually were in Sumerian thought. The word doesn't translate neatly into any modern concept. Divine decrees, yes, but more tangible than that. Fundamental principles, certainly, but with a physicality that pure abstractions lack. Some translations render me as divine powers, others as cultural norms, still others as cosmic ordinances. But all these translations miss something essential about how the Sumerians understood the me. In the texts, the me can be given, stolen, carried from place to place. They have a quasi-physical existence. They can be loaded onto a boat. They can be possessed by one being and transferred to another. They're not just ideas or concepts, but something more concrete, something that could be held and moved and bestowed. The lists of me that appear in various texts give us insight into what the Sumerians considered the essential components of civilization. One tablet catalogues over 100 individual me, ranging from the obviously important like kingship, the throne, the crown, and the scepter, to the surprisingly specific like the art of metalworking, the art of leatherworking, the art of basket weaving. There are me for music and musical instruments, me for various types of priesthood, me for sexual practices, me for emotions like fear and dismay, me for abstract concepts like truth and falsehood. Reading through the lists feels like examining an ancient database of everything that makes human civilization possible, from the material crafts to the social structures to the emotional and intellectual capacities that allow complex society to function. And all of these, according to the Sumerian worldview, originated with the gods, were held by the gods, specifically by Enki in his temple at Eridu. The me weren't human inventions that were then attributed to divine inspiration. They were divine possessions that predated human civilization, that existed before humans had culture, that were then deliberately given to humanity by the gods who possessed them. The distinction matters because it reflects how the Sumerians understood their own history. They didn't see civilization as something humans slowly developed through trial and error. They saw it as something complete that was gifted to them, a package of knowledge and skills that arrived from outside the human sphere, brought by beings who already possessed it. What makes the concept of the me even stranger is its consistency across centuries of Sumerian literature. This isn't a minor theological detail that appears in one or two texts. The me are referenced throughout Mesopotamian religious writings, from the earlier Sumerian compositions through Babylonian and Assyrian adaptations. The word remains unchanged, the concept remains central, the understanding that civilization's fundamental components came from the gods, rather than from human ingenuity, persists through millennia of cultural transmission. Either this represents a remarkably durable mythological framework that multiple cultures found compelling, or it preserves some kind of cultural memory that the Sumerians considered too important to let fade, something about their origins that needed to be recorded and preserved and passed forward through time. One of the most detailed accounts of the me and their transfer appears in a text called Inanna and Enki, and it reads less like religious allegory and more like an account of intellectual property theft. The goddess Inanna, associated with the city of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit Enki. He hosts a great feast. They drink beer together, and in his inebriated state, Enki begins giving Inanna the me, the sacred decrees, one after another after another. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, Inanna has already fled back to Uruk with the me loaded onto her boat, carrying the complete package of civilization from one city to another. The myth was told and retold, copied and preserved, suggesting the Sumerians saw it as a key moment in their history, a moment when knowledge was physically moved from one location to another by beings who possessed it first. The text survives in multiple copies, found at different sites across Mesopotamia, indicating it was widely known and frequently copied. The narrative unfolds with surprising specificity. Inanna approaches Eridu by boat, travelling along the waterways that connected Sumerian cities. Enki receives her warmly, orders his servant to prepare a feast, and the two deities settle in to eat and drink. The text describes Enki's progressive intoxication in detail, each stage of drunkenness marked by his giving Inanna another set of me. First, the crown and scepter of kingship, then the priestly office and divine throne, then truth and descent into the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the art of kissing, on and on. 14 distinct gifts, each containing multiple me, over 100 fundamental principles of civilization handed over in a drunken stupor. When Enki wakes the next morning and asks his servant about Inanna's visit, he learns to his horror that he gave away the me, the complete toolkit of civilization. He immediately sends his servant Isimud to intercept Inanna and bring back the me before she can reach Uruk. The text describes a chase, Isimud pursuing Inanna's boat through the waterways, catching up to her at 6 different stopping points along the journey. At each point, Isimud demands the return of the me. At each point, Inanna refuses, and her assistant Ninshubur drives Isimud away. Finally, Inanna reaches Uruk with the me intact, and Enki, despite his attempts to recover them, accepts that Uruk now possesses what had belonged to Eridu. What's remarkable about this myth is its matter-of-fact treatment of knowledge transfer. The me aren't abstract concepts that spontaneously arise in human consciousness. They're specific things that can be given, carried, stolen, moved from one location to another. The myth presents civilization not as an inevitable human development, but as something that had to be actively transmitted, that existed in Eridu first and then spread to Uruk through Inanna's successful theft. And while the story includes divine beings and supernatural elements, its basic structure resembles historical accounts of knowledge transmission between cities, of how one culture learns from another, of how civilization spreads geographically through contact and exchange. The Sumerians preserved this story for millennia. Scribes copied it. Generations of students learned it. The myth became part of the cultural foundation of Mesopotamian civilization. Why preserve an account of drunken knowledge theft unless it represented something the Sumerians considered genuinely important about their history? Perhaps the myth encoded memory of actual cultural transmission between Eridu and Uruk, of a moment when Uruk gained the knowledge and prestige that had belonged to the older city. Or perhaps it preserves something stranger, a memory of how civilization arrived in Mesopotamia in the first place, given by beings the Sumerians could only describe as gods, transferred from the divine realm to the human world through specific acts at specific times, knowledge that could be held and moved and bestowed because it existed as something more than human innovation. When scholars finally translated the mathematical and astronomical tablets from Mesopotamia, they found something that made no sense for a supposedly primitive civilization just emerging from the Stone Age. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, the same system that still divides our hours and minutes and circles, a system so mathematically sophisticated it suggests advanced abstract thinking. They tracked the precession of the equinoxes, a movement of the heavens so slow it takes 72 years for a single degree shift, meaning you can't observe it in a lifetime. You need multi-generational coordinated observation. They knew the planets as distinct from stars. They calculated lunar cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched again until the invention of the telescope. And they organized the sky into constellations we still use today. All of this appeared in the earliest layers of Sumerian culture, not gradually developing but present from the start, as if the knowledge was inherited rather than discovered. The base 60 system, called sexagesimal, remains one of the great puzzles of mathematical history. Why would early humans count in groups of 60 rather than the more intuitive 10, the number of fingers on our hands? The system requires holding complex relationships in mind, understanding place value in ways that seem advanced for people who supposedly just invented writing. Yet there it is in the earliest tablets, fully formed and consistently applied. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, 6 times 60. They divided the day into 24 hours, and we still do. They divided each hour into 60 minutes, each minute into 60 seconds, and those divisions persist 5,000 years later because the system works so elegantly for astronomical calculations, for dividing time and space with mathematical precision. But it's the astronomical knowledge that truly astonishes. The precession of the equinoxes is subtle, invisible to casual observation. The axis of the Earth wobbles slowly, like a spinning top losing momentum, completing one full cycle every 25,772 years. This wobble means the position of stars against the backdrop of the zodiac shifts gradually, 1 degree every 72 years. You cannot observe this in a lifetime. You need coordinated, multi-generational observation, careful record-keeping across centuries, mathematical analysis sophisticated enough to detect and measure the slow drift. And the Sumerians knew about precession. Their texts reference it. Their calculations account for it. Their astronomical observations are adjusted for it. How? How did a civilization just emerging from prehistory possess knowledge that requires centuries of precise observation to discover? They knew the planets too, distinguished them from stars not by modern telescopes, but through patient observation of the night sky. They knew that certain bright points of light moved against the fixed stars, wandering through the constellations in predictable patterns. They named these wanderers Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. They tracked their movements, predicted their positions, understood that these objects were fundamentally different from stars. Modern astronomy confirms their classifications were accurate. They correctly identified which objects were planets and which were stars, without instruments beyond the naked eye. The lunar calculations are equally impressive. The Sumerians understood the Saros cycle, the period of 18 years, 11 days and 8 hours, after which eclipses repeat in almost identical patterns. Discovering this cycle requires tracking eclipses across decades, recognizing patterns in when and where they occur, making mathematical calculations that account for the complex interactions of sun, moon, and earth. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian astronomical knowledge, could predict eclipses centuries in advance with accuracy that wouldn't be matched until the modern era. And this knowledge appears fully formed in the earliest astronomical texts, not building gradually from simple moon watching, but present from the beginning as a complete system of celestial mechanics. The constellations themselves tell a story of deep antiquity. Many constellations we use today, the zodiacal signs, the great patterns of stars that divide the night sky, originated in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians organized the heavens into coherent patterns, and those patterns persisted through Babylonian, Greek, and Roman astronomy into modern star charts. Why those specific patterns? Why group those particular stars into images of lions as bulls and scorpions? The arbitrariness of constellation shapes suggests cultural transmission rather than independent discovery. When cultures around the world look at the night sky, they see different patterns, different mythologies written in the stars. But Western and Middle Eastern astronomy inherited the Sumerian divisions, the Mesopotamian vision of how the heavens should be organized. And those divisions appear complete in the earliest texts, as if the pattern was established before writing transmitted whole rather than developing gradually. In the collection of the British Museum rest 2 tablets covered in cuneiform lists, catalogues of stars and planets and constellations compiled around 700 BCE, but describing astronomical knowledge far older. The Mulapin tablets, named after the first constellation they list, contain the most complete ancient star catalogue we possess from Mesopotamia. They list rising times, seasonal appearances, distances between stars measured in abstract units, mathematical predictions of eclipses, and detailed tracking of the planets, including notes on retrograde motion that wouldn't be understood in Europe until Copernicus. But what puzzles historians is that this knowledge appears fully formed in the earliest texts, not building slowly from simple observation, but present from the beginning of writing itself. It's as if the Sumerians were recording information someone else had already compiled, preserving knowledge rather than discovering it. The tablets, catalogued as British Museum numbers 86,378 and 86,379, consist of multiple columns of cuneiform text organised into clear sections. The first tablet begins with the list of constellations visible along the path of the moon, 33 in total, describing when they rise and set throughout the year. The precision is remarkable. On the 15th day of month Nisanu, the hired man rises in the east. When the stars of Enlil stand in the eastern sky for 2/3 of a watch, and the stars of Ea for 1/3 of a watch, it is the beginning of Nisanu. The text assumes readers understand complex timekeeping based on star positions, suggesting astronomical observation was already an established science when the tablets were compiled. But here's what troubles historians. The Mulapin tablets were copied around 700 BCE, but they describe celestial positions that don't match the 7th century sky. The precession of the equinoxes means star positions shift, slowly over centuries, and when modern astronomers calculate backward, accounting for precession, the star positions described in Mulapin match the sky not from 700 BCE, but from around 1500 to 1000 BCE, or even earlier. The Babylonian scribes who copied these tablets were recording knowledge that was already ancient, information compiled centuries or even a millennium before their time, preserved because it was considered fundamentally important. The second tablet grows even more technical. It describes how to predict the visibility of planets, calculating when they'll appear as morning stars or evening stars. It catalogues the paths of the sun and moon through the zodiac, dividing the year into mathematical segments. It lists intercalary months, the extra months added periodically to keep lunar calendars aligned with solar years. It describes how to predict eclipses using mathematical formulas based on repeated observations of celestial patterns. All of this requires not just watching the sky, but understanding the mathematical relationships underlying celestial motion, recognizing patterns that repeat over years or decades, possessing computational methods sophisticated enough to predict future astronomical events. The section on retrograde planetary motion is particularly striking. The text describes how planets normally move eastward against the background stars but periodically reverse direction, appearing to move westward for a time before resuming their eastward course. This retrograde motion puzzled astronomers for millennia, wasn't properly explained until Copernicus understood that planets orbit the Sun at different speeds, creating apparent backward motion when Earth overtakes an outer planet, or is overtaken by an inner one. But the Mulapin tablets, compiled in the first millennium BCE, from sources much older, accurately describe retrograde motion, track its patterns, even attempt mathematical predictions of when it will occur. How did ancient Mesopotamian astronomers achieve this level of understanding without modern planetary models? The answer, according to the tablets themselves, was patient observation across generations. Mesopotamian priests watched the sky for centuries, kept detailed records, compared observations across time, gradually building a database of celestial behavior. This explanation satisfies most historians. It requires no mysterious outside knowledge, no supernatural intervention, just human diligence and intellectual curiosity applied systematically across many lifetimes. And yet, the very earliest astronomical texts show this knowledge already present, already systematized, already being recorded in permanent form rather than being slowly discovered. The Sumerians wrote about astronomy not as explorers charting unknown territory, but as scribes copying information, preserving what was already known, maintaining records that mustn't be lost. Their tablets read less like original research and more like textbooks, teaching material based on an already established body of knowledge. And when asked where that knowledge came from, the Sumerians had an answer. It descended from heaven, taught by the Anunnaki, given to humanity by Enki, part of the me that made civilization possible. In Sumerian cosmology, the universe was divided into clear domains, and the highest realm, the most removed from human existence, was the domain of Anu, the sky god whose name literally meant heaven. Anu rarely descended to earth in the myths. He remained above, in a celestial palace or city the texts describe with surprising specificity. His realm had gates, assembly halls, councils where decisions about earthly affairs were made by divine beings who could see the human world below. The Anunnaki, according to multiple tablets, descended from this heavenly realm, travelling down to earth for various purposes, bringing knowledge, making judgments, interacting with humanity. Modern interpreters see this as purely mythological, obvious personification of sky and cosmos. But the Sumerians wrote about Anu's heaven with the same matter-of-fact tone they used for describing their own cities, their own kings, their own historical events. The architectural language used to describe Anu's domain is remarkably specific. The text mentioned gates that could be opened and closed, suggesting controlled access rather than abstract spiritual realm. They describe halls where the Anunnaki gathered in assembly, making collective decisions about matters concerning Earth and humanity. One tablet describes how Anu sits on his throne while the lesser gods stand in rows before him, suggesting hierarchy and physical space, chamber large enough to accommodate multiple divine beings in organized arrangement. Another text mentions the 7 gates of Anu's heaven, each requiring passage and permission, creating layers of access that mirror the security arrangements of earthly palaces and temples. What's striking is how the Sumerians conceived of heaven not as formless spiritual existence, but as actual place with geography, architecture, social organization. When they wrote about Anu's realm, they used the same vocabulary they applied to describing Ur or Uruk or Eridu. Heaven had location, even if that location was above in some cosmic sense. It had structures, buildings, gates, walls. It had inhabitants who performed specific roles, who gathered for councils, who descended on missions to the world below. The divine realm, in Sumerian thought, wasn't transcendent beyond materiality, but rather existed as another level of material reality, separated from Earth not by fundamental difference in substance, but by distance and elevation. Multiple texts describe the Anunnaki descending from Anu's heaven to earth, and the language of descent is consistent across centuries of literature. They came down. They travelled from above to below. They crossed the boundary between heavenly realm and earthly realm, and crucially, this wasn't one-way journey. The texts describe gods ascending back to heaven, returning to Anu's realm after completing their earthly missions. This bidirectional travel between heaven and earth permeates Sumerian mythology, appears so frequently and consistently that it seems to represent core belief rather than isolated metaphor. One particularly detailed text describes how the Anunnaki gathered in assembly in Anu's heavenly palace to decide the fate of the city Uruk. They debated whether the city deserved blessing or punishment, whether its king was worthy of divine support. After deliberation, they sent representatives down to earth to implement their decision. The text treats this as straightforward diplomatic process, divine council operating with same bureaucratic procedures as human governments. There's no mystical vagueness here, no poetic abstraction. The narrative unfolds like political chronicle. Assembly convenes, arguments are presented, vote is taken, emissaries are dispatched to carry out the decision. The specificity makes modern readers uncomfortable because it doesn't fit our categories for religious literature. We expect myths to be obviously symbolic, clearly metaphorical, using concrete imagery to express abstract spiritual truths. But Sumerian descriptions of Anu's heaven read less like symbolism and more like straightforward description of place they believed actually existed, populated by beings who made real decisions with real consequences for human affairs. Either the Sumerians were remarkably committed to elaborate fiction they presented as fact, or they were describing cosmology they genuinely believed reflected actual structure of reality, actual location where actual beings dwelt, and from which they descended to interact with humanity below. If Anu's heaven was the realm above, then the Abzu was the realm below and beyond, and its nature in Sumerian thought was strange and fluid, sometimes beneath the earth, sometimes beneath the ocean, sometimes seeming to be a cosmic realm that existed outside normal space entirely. Enki, the god of wisdom and water and civilization, was the lord of the Abzu, and multiple texts describe him rising from this deep place to establish his temple at Eridu, bringing knowledge from the watery depths to the surface world of humanity. The Abzu was described as containing fresh water that fed all earthly springs and rivers, but also as containing knowledge, secrets, wisdom that existed before the earth itself. When temple excavations at Eridu uncovered multiple layers going back millennia, each rebuilt temple sitting atop the ruins of the last, archaeologists found that every single foundation incorporated ritual bowls of fresh water, an offering to the Abzu, to the deep from which Enki had emerged. The word Abzu itself, sometimes written as Apsu, carries connotations that defy simple translation. It means the deep, the abyss, the underground freshwater ocean. But in religious texts, it takes on dimensions that go beyond physical geography. The Abzu was Enki's dwelling place before he came to Eridu. It was the source of his wisdom, the repository of secret knowledge, the place where the me existed before being brought to humanity. One text describes the Abzu as containing the secrets of heaven and earth, suggesting it was cosmic archive, universal library where fundamental truths about reality were stored. The relationship between water and wisdom in Sumerian thought centers on the Abzu, fresh water. The water that makes life possible in the arid Mesopotamian landscape flows from underground aquifers, mysterious sources hidden beneath the earth. The Sumerians naturally wondered where this life-giving water came from, and their answer was the Abzu, cosmic deep that fed all earthly springs. But they extended this physical observation into metaphysical realm. Just as fresh water flows up from hidden depths to nourish the land, wisdom flows up from the Abzu to nourish human civilization. Enki controlled both flows, master of waters and master of knowledge, and both originated in the mysterious deep from which he'd emerged. Archaeological evidence at Eridu supports the centrality of this belief. When Leonard Woolley excavated the temple complex in the 1920s, he found that water offerings had been incorporated into the foundations from the very earliest level. Even the most ancient shrine, the simple reed structure at the bottom of the tell, had ritual vessels designed to hold fresh water, placed in the foundation as offering to the Abzu. This practice continued through 17 successive rebuilding phases, spanning over 2,000 years. Each generation of priests, each reconstruction of the temple, maintained the same ritual. Fresh water offered to the deep, acknowledging Enki's origin in the Abzu, maintaining connection between surface temple and cosmic depth below. One cuneiform text describes a journey Enki made through the Abzu, travelling through its various regions, establishing order and assigning responsibilities to lesser deities. The text treats the Abzu as actual place with geography that could be traversed, with different zones requiring organisation and governance. It describes Enki moving through these regions, making decrees, establishing cosmic order, functioning as administrator organising territory under his control. Again, the language is specific, practical, bureaucratic rather than mystical. The Abzu had structure, organisation, inhabitants, all governed by Enki, who dwelt there before rising to the surface to establish civilization among humans. The mystery deepens when you consider that multiple cultures around the ancient world, cultures that had contact with Mesopotamian civilization, developed similar concepts of wisdom coming from watery depths. The Oannes figure in later Babylonian tradition, described by the priest Berossus in the 3rd century BCE, was a fishman who emerged from the sea to teach the Babylonians writing, arts, and sciences before returning to the deep. Egyptian creation myths feature the primordial waters of Nun from which all existence emerged. Biblical texts reference the Tehom, the deep waters of creation. These parallels might simply reflect shared human association of depth with mystery, of water with life and knowledge, or they might preserve variant memories of same basic narrative. Knowledge came from the deep, brought by beings who emerged from watery realms to teach surface-dwelling humanity. In museums around the world, small stone cylinders covered in microscopic carved scenes sit in temperature-controlled cases, remnants of Sumerian administrative practice. Cylinder seals were rolled across wet clay to mark ownership, seal documents, authenticate transactions. But the images carved into these tiny stones tell stories that go beyond commerce and bureaucracy. Many depict figures the archaeologists and curators label as gods, but the scenes themselves are strangely specific, almost documentary. Figures descending from above, surrounded by star symbols. Winged beings that don't match any bird on earth. Tall figures standing among shorter ones, suggesting physical differences the Sumerians thought important enough to depict again and again. Scenes of beings handing objects to humans, teaching gestures, presentation of gifts. The seals span centuries of Sumerian history, but the imagery remains remarkably consistent, as if recording something real, something remembered. The seals themselves are tiny, typically 2 to 3 centimeters in diameter, 5 to 6 centimeters long, carved from hard stones like lapis lazuli, carnelian or hematite. The skill required to carve such detailed scenes into such small spaces is extraordinary, requiring specialized tools and steady hands and artistic vision that could work in miniature. But what the seal cutters chose to depict, again and again across generations, reveals what the Sumerians considered important enough to preserve in these personal artifacts that would be used daily, rolled onto clay tablets hundreds or thousands of times. One common motif shows a seated figure, clearly of high status based on size and positioning, with a smaller standing figure approaching, often with hand raised in gesture of respect or supplication. Between them sometimes floats a star symbol, a sun disk, or a crescent moon. These scenes are typically interpreted as humans approaching gods, religious iconography showing proper devotional behavior. But look closer at the proportions. The seated figures are consistently depicted as much larger than the standing figures, and this isn't just artistic convention for showing importance. Other seals show groups of similar-sized figures, all human, where status is indicated through crowns or position rather than size. But in these particular scenes, the size difference seems deliberate, consistent, suggesting the Sumerians were depicting actual physical difference between the beings, not just metaphorical importance. Another recurring image shows a figure flanked by serpents, often with water flowing from their shoulders or arms, streams of liquid pouring out to either side. This is identified as Enki, master of the Abzu, source of fresh water and wisdom. But the serpents are rendered with surprising anatomical precision, not stylized decorations but carefully observed reptilian forms, and the water flowing from the figure's body creates impression of conduit, channel through which something flows from divine realm to earthly reality. The seals depicting this imagery span from the early dynastic period around 2900 BCE through the end of Sumerian civilization, remarkably stable iconography maintained across 1,000 years. Then there are the seals, showing what can only be described as technological imagery. One seal, now in the Louvre, shows a tall figure manipulating objects that look disturbingly like equipment, complex arrangements of spheres and cylinders that don't match any natural forms. Other seals show figures holding objects with radiating lines, conventionally interpreted as weapons or scepters, but looking more like tools or instruments. Still others depict scenes of figures working with objects arranged in precise geometric patterns, suggesting engineering or construction rather than religious ritual. The most puzzling seals show scenes of ascent and descent. Figures climbing or descending stepped structures, sometimes with wings, sometimes without, but always in motion between levels. Stars or celestial symbols frame these scenes, placing them in cosmic context. Modern interpretation reads these as mythological journeys, gods moving between divine and earthly realms in symbolic representation. But the imagery has documentary quality, specific detail that suggests the seal cutters were depicting actual events or actual processes they had been told about, carving scenes that recorded rather than invented. What makes these seals particularly significant is their function. These weren't religious artifacts locked away in temples, weren't decorative art for elite display. These were practical objects used in daily commerce and administration. Every merchant, every administrator, every person involved in documented transactions owned a seal. The imagery carved into these seals represented what the owners considered important, meaningful, worth carrying with them and impressing into clay thousands of times over their lives. The consistency of imagery across centuries, across different cities, across social classes, suggests these weren't individual artistic choices, but shared cultural understanding, collective memory preserved in miniature form on stones that touch the clay of daily life. Here is something that puzzles linguists and archaeologists more than almost any other aspect of Sumerian culture. Writing appears suddenly, fully formed, complex, and capable of expressing abstract concepts. There's no long period of gradual development from simple pictures to sophisticated script. The earliest tablets discovered, dating to around 3200 BCE, already use cuneiform in elaborate ways, recording not just quantities of grain but grammatically complex sentences, religious concepts, astronomical data, mathematical formulas. It's as if literacy arrived as a complete package rather than evolving slowly from pictographs. And the Sumerians themselves claimed exactly that writing was a gift from the gods, specifically from Nabu, the scribe of heaven, another deity associated with divine knowledge descended from the sky. The problem of writing's sudden appearance troubles specialists in the evolution of language and literacy. In other cultures where we can observe writing developing, the process is gradual, traceable through clear stages. Egyptian hieroglyphs evolved from pictographic symbols to more abstract signs over centuries. Chinese writing shows similar gradual development, from oracle bone inscriptions through increasingly stylized forms. Mayan glyphs developed in observable stages from pictorial to more complex logographic and syllabic elements. But Sumerian cuneiform appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated, already capable of recording complex grammatical structures, already being used for diverse purposes from accounting to literature. The earliest tablets from Uruk, dated to approximately 3200 BCE, are already using hundreds of different signs, combining them in systematic ways that indicate grammatical understanding. The signs aren't simple pictures directly representing objects. They're already abstract, wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, with a reed stylus cut to specific angle. The system already employs phonetic elements, where signs represent sounds rather than things. It already uses determinatives, signs that aren't pronounced but indicate categories, helping readers understand how to interpret ambiguous signs. All of this sophistication, present from the earliest examples we possess. Some scholars argue that writing must have developed earlier, that we simply haven't found the transitional stages yet, that future excavations will uncover simpler proto-writing that bridges the gap between no writing and sophisticated cuneiform. It's possible. Archaeological preservation is imperfect. Early experimental writing might have been done on perishable materials that haven't survived. But the counter-argument is compelling. We have thousands of tablets from the earliest literate period, extensive archives from Uruk and other early sites. If writing was developing gradually, we should see variation in the tablets, some using simpler systems, some more complex, evidence of experimentation and refinement. Instead, we see remarkable consistency, as if the scribes were following established system rather than inventing it in real time. The tablets themselves show clear organization from the beginning. Scribes ruled straight lines to guide text, creating neat columns and rows. They used consistent sign sizes, maintained regular spacing, followed formatting conventions that suggest training in established methods. One tablet from Uruk is a lexical list, a teaching document listing signs with their meanings, exactly the kind of instructional material you'd create for training new scribes in an already existing writing system. The earliest literate period already had schools, curriculum, standardized instruction in how to write. This level of educational infrastructure doesn't develop overnight. It requires established system being transmitted through formal training, not experimentation and innovation. And what were they writing about in these earliest tablets? Not just accounting, though there's plenty of that. Careful records of grain allotments and livestock counts and temple offerings, but also literature, religious texts, astronomical observations, mathematical problems. One early tablet records the names of gods in organized lists. Another contains what appears to be mythological narrative, fragmentary but recognizable as storytelling rather than mere record-keeping. Another calculates areas of fields using geometric formulas. The diversity of content suggests writing was adopted wholesale for multiple purposes simultaneously, not gradually expanding from simple record-keeping to more complex applications over centuries. The Sumerians credited the god Nabu, divine scribe, with giving humanity the gift of writing. Nabu was described as dwelling in heaven, recording the fates of humans, possessing the tablets of destiny on which cosmic and earthly affairs were written. He descended to teach humans how to write, how to press wedges into clay to preserve knowledge across time. Modern scholars see this as obvious mythology, attributing human innovation to divine agency, as ancient peoples always did. But the Sumerians' insistence that writing was taught rather than invented, that it came from outside human culture rather than emerging from within, aligns strangely with how writing actually appears in the archaeological record. Suddenly, completely, systematically, as if someone introduced a fully developed technology rather than humans slowly figuring it out through trial and error. The Fertile Crescent earned its name from the rapid development of agriculture that transformed the region starting around 10,000 years ago. But the speed and sophistication of Sumerian farming practices suggests knowledge transfer rather than slow experimentation. They practiced irrigation engineering that required mathematical precision and coordinated planning. They selectively bred crops with understanding of heredity that shouldn't exist before modern genetics. They rotated fields using systems that demonstrated knowledge of soil depletion. They calculated ideal planting and harvesting times using astronomical observation. All of this appears in the earliest urban period, not developing gradually but present from the formation of the first cities. The tablets credit Enki and the Anunnaki with teaching these skills, and perhaps that's just myth-making, giving divine origin to practical knowledge. Or perhaps the Sumerians were recording what they believed to be actual history. Consider the complexity of irrigation engineering in southern Mesopotamia. The region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was naturally marshy and flood-prone, not ideal for agriculture without extensive modification. The Sumerians dug canals, hundreds of kilometers of them eventually, creating networks that diverted river water to fields, drained excess water to prevent flooding, maintained constant flow rates through careful calculation of gradient and volume. This wasn't simple ditch digging. It required understanding of water flow dynamics, mathematical ability to calculate precise slopes, organizational capacity to coordinate massive labor projects, and administrative systems to maintain and regulate water distribution across multiple cities. The tablets describe detailed regulations about water rights, which farmers could draw from which canals, how disputes over water would be resolved, what maintenance obligations each city or neighborhood bore for the canal system serving their fields. These regulations presume irrigation infrastructure already exists, already functions as essential backbone of agriculture, and that infrastructure appears archaeologically very early in Sumerian urban development. The city and the canals emerged together, as if planned as integrated system rather than cities developing first and gradually adding irrigation later. Agricultural texts from Mesopotamia, some dating back nearly 4,000 years, describe farming techniques with sophisticated understanding of plant biology and soil science. They discuss crop rotation, planting legumes to restore soil fertility after grain crops. This practice requires understanding that soil can be depleted and that specific plants restore what others remove, knowledge that seems remarkable for ancient farmers, but that appears in the earliest agricultural literature as established practice rather than new discovery. They describe selective breeding, saving seeds from the best plants, choosing for specific characteristics over generations. Again, this demonstrates understanding of heredity, of how traits pass from parent to offspring and can be influenced through careful selection. The astronomical calculations of planting times show integration between celestial observation and agricultural practice. Tablets describe optimal planting dates based on stellar risings, lunar phases, solar position. This requires understanding the relationship between seasonal cycles and crop growth, knowledge of how different plants respond to temperature and day length, ability to use astronomical observation to predict Earth's seasonal changes. The Sumerians weren't just watching the sky for religious reasons. They were using astronomical knowledge for practical agricultural planning, timing their planting and harvesting to maximize yields based on celestial calendars that required multi-generational observation to perfect. Archaeological evidence shows that Sumerian agriculture was extraordinarily productive, capable of generating the surpluses that supported the first large urban populations in human history. Fields were yielding enough grain not just to feed farmers, but to support priests, scribes, craftsmen, administrators, soldiers, all the specialized roles that urban civilization requires. Achieving this level of productivity requires advanced agricultural knowledge, proper irrigation, soil management, crop selection, pest control, storage techniques to preserve harvest through the year. All of this was operating by the early dynastic period, by the time we have clear archaeological evidence of the first true cities. The tablets that describe these agricultural practices credit Enki with teaching them, with showing humans how to farm properly, how to manage water, how to organize labor for maximum efficiency. The God of Wisdom, they wrote, brought the knowledge of cultivation from the Abzu, established the proper methods, set the standards that Sumerian farmers followed for millennia. Whether you interpret this as pure mythology or as cultural memory encoded in religious language, the fact remains that the Sumerians saw their agricultural sophistication as something given rather than slowly developed, knowledge transmitted from divine realm to human practice, taught by beings who possessed it before humans did. When archaeologists measure the ruins of Sumerian ziggurats, when they map the layouts of temple complexes at Ur and Uruk and Eridu, they find geometric precision that requires sophisticated mathematical knowledge. Right angles achieved without modern instruments. Astronomical alignments calculated with extraordinary accuracy. Proportional systems based on the same base 60 mathematics used in their astronomical tablets. The question that bothers architectural historians is simple. Where did this precision come from in a supposedly early civilization? The Sumerians themselves answered, from the gods who gave them the divine decrees that included architecture, measurement, and the art of building temples that connected earth to heaven. The great ziggurat of Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, demonstrates this precision dramatically. The structure was built around 2100 BCE, during the reign of Ur-Nammu, but it followed architectural principles already ancient by that time. The base is a perfect rectangle, 62.5 meters by 43 meters, with corners aligned precisely to the cardinal directions. The walls don't rise vertically but slope inward at carefully calculated angles, creating optical illusion of greater height while ensuring structural stability. Modern architects studying the ruins discovered that the seemingly solid brick construction incorporates drainage systems, expansion joints, and ventilation shafts, engineering solutions that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of structural mechanics and material behavior. But it's the astronomical alignments that truly astonish. The corners of the ziggurat align not just to north, south, east, and west, but to specific points on the horizon where certain stars rise at particular times of year. The entrance faces the winter solstice sunrise. The main stairway aligns with the summer solstice sunset. These alignments require years of observation to establish, mathematical calculations to translate celestial positions into architectural orientations, and construction precision to implement the calculated angles in massive stone and brick structures. The margin of error in these alignments is typically less than 1 degree, remarkable for monuments built over 4,000 years ago without theodolites, laser levels, or GPS. Temple complexes at Uruk show similar precision dating back even earlier, to around 3200 BCE. The Inanna complex, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, covers multiple acres, with buildings arranged according to proportional system based on the Sumerian cubit, approximately 50 centimeters. But the proportions aren't arbitrary. Room dimensions, courtyard sizes, wall thicknesses all follow mathematical relationships derived from that base 60 system that governs their astronomy and mathematics. Rooms are designed as rectangles with length-to-width ratios of 3:2, 5:3, 7:4, ratios that produce harmonious proportions pleasing to the eye while serving practical functions. The Sumerians understood load-bearing capacity, knew how thick walls needed to be to support roofs of different spans. They knew how to calculate volume for planning construction projects, estimating how many bricks would be required, how much labour, how long construction would take. Tablets from temple archives contain exactly these kinds of calculations, detailed project plans listing materials, workers, time estimates, all organised with mathematical precision that would be recognisable to modern construction managers. These weren't simple builders working by intuition and trial and error. These were engineers applying systematic mathematical knowledge to practical problems. The religious significance of this architectural precision was explicit in Sumerian thought. Temples were called the house, but specifically the house where heaven and earth connected, where divine and human realms intersected. The ziggurat, the stepped pyramid form that dominated Mesopotamian sacred architecture, was called zikkuratu, meaning to build high, creating mountain where flat river plain offered no natural heights. The summit of the ziggurat held the temple chamber where the god dwelt, where priests performed rituals that linked earth below to heaven above. This architectural form encoded Sumerian cosmology in built space, humanity dwelling on the plain, gods dwelling in heights, and the ziggurat creating pathway between them. Building such structures required the me, those divine decrees that included not just the abstract concept of architecture, but the practical knowledge of measurement, calculation, structural engineering, astronomical alignment. The texts are explicit about this. The me of construction, the me of carpentry, the me of brickmaking, all were gifts from Enki, taught to humanity rather than discovered through slow experimentation. Whether you interpret this as mythology or as encoded history, the Sumerian achievement remains. They built with precision that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge, and they did so from the very beginning of their urban civilization, as if the knowledge arrived complete rather than developing gradually over centuries. Throughout Sumerian iconography, one symbol appears with mysterious frequency: the serpent, often intertwined with the rod that became the caduceus of medicine, associated with Enki and the transmission of knowledge from divine to human realm. The serpent in Mesopotamian thought wasn't evil, wasn't demonic. It was connected to wisdom, to healing, to the mysteries of life and death, and specifically to Enki, the god who gave humanity the knowledge of civilization. In Sumerian art, Enki appears flanked by serpents, or with serpents emerging from his shoulders, or intertwined with the pillars of his temple. When British archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated the temple of Enki at Eridu in the 1920s and 30s, he found serpent motifs in every level, going back to the earliest foundations. The serpent, the bearer of knowledge, the creature that moves between worlds, between earth and underworld, between human and divine. The association between serpents and wisdom appears across multiple ancient cultures, but in Mesopotamia the connection was particularly strong and particularly ancient. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period, around 2900 BCE, show Enki with serpents flowing from his body, their coiled forms intertwining with streams of water, creating visual fusion of wisdom, water, and serpent symbolism. The caduceus, the rod with two serpents wrapped around it, appears in Sumerian art thousands of years before its adoption as symbol of medicine in later Greek and Roman culture. In Mesopotamian context, the intertwined serpents represented the dual nature of knowledge, healing and harming, life and death, the dangerous power of wisdom that can elevate or destroy. The serpent's ability to shed its skin made it natural symbol for renewal, transformation, the cycle of death and rebirth. But in Sumerian thought, this biological feature took on deeper significance. The serpent represented transformation through knowledge, the way wisdom changes those who possess it, the way learning is itself a kind of death and rebirth, shedding old understanding for new. Enki, as the teacher god, as the bringer of civilization, naturally attracted serpent symbolism because he transformed humanity, changed humans from wandering tribes to settled civilizations through the gift of knowledge. But there's something more specific in the Sumerian serpent imagery. The serpents associated with Enki aren't generic symbolic creatures. They're depicted with anatomical precision, with scales, with forked tongues, with the distinctive head shape of actual serpents. And they're shown in specific context, emerging from water, rising from the Abzu, accompanying the transfer of knowledge from divine to human realm. One particularly striking seal shows Enki seated on his throne with water flowing from the Abzu beneath, and two great serpents rising from the water on either side of him, their heads level with his shoulders, their bodies forming archway or gateway through which knowledge passes. The temple excavations at Eridu revealed that serpent symbolism was embedded in the sacred architecture itself. Serpent forms appeared in foundation deposits, in wall decorations, in the ritual objects found in temple chambers. One particularly significant find was a copper serpent figure, carefully crafted and deliberately placed in the foundations of one of the early temple levels, an offering or possibly a symbolic guardian placed there when the temple was built. The serpent wasn't threatening in this context. It was protective, associated with the sacred space, with Enki's presence, with the temple's function as conduit for divine wisdom. Later biblical tradition, influenced by Mesopotamian culture through centuries of contact and exchange, inverted this symbolism. The serpent in Eden became tempter, the one who offered knowledge as sin rather than gift. But even in that inversion, the core association remains. Serpent equals knowledge. The difference is theological interpretation. In Mesopotamian thought, the serpent's gift of knowledge was positive, transformative, the foundation of civilization. The creature that moves between worlds, that dwells in hidden places beneath the earth, that knows the mysteries of life and death, naturally became associated with the god who brought hidden knowledge from the Abzu to transform human existence. What's remarkable is how persistent this symbolism remained. From the earliest Sumerian period through Babylonian and Assyrian culture, spanning 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, the serpent maintained its association with Enki, with wisdom, with the transmission of knowledge. This consistency suggests the symbol carried meaning that transcended individual artistic choices, that represented fundamental Sumerian understanding about the nature and origin of their civilization. The serpent wasn't decorative, it was emblematic, encoding in visual form the story the tablets told in words. Knowledge came from the deep, brought by Enki, transmitted to humanity, transforming everything. In 1976, a book appeared that would bring Sumerian tablets into mainstream speculation and controversy. Zecharia Sitchin's The 12th Planet proposed a startling interpretation of Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki weren't gods or myths, they were extraterrestrial beings from a planet called Nibiru, who genetically engineered humans as a labour force for gold mining, and left behind records of their presence in Sumerian cuneiform. Sitchin's work was immediately controversial. Mainstream academics dismissed his translations as fundamentally flawed, his planetary models as scientifically impossible, his interpretations as unsupported by linguistic evidence. And yet Sitchin brought attention to genuine questions that archaeology had been quietly wrestling with for decades. Why did civilization appear so suddenly? Why did the Sumerians describe their knowledge as coming from the sky? Why does their cosmology include detailed astronomical information they shouldn't possess? Sitchin's theory captured public imagination precisely because it offered concrete answers to mysteries that academic archaeology acknowledged but couldn't quite explain. He translated Anunnaki literally as those who from heaven to earth came, and took it at face value. They came from the sky, therefore they came from space, therefore they were extraterrestrial visitors. He interpreted references to the Abzu not as mythological underworld, but as mining operations deep beneath the Earth's surface. He read the creation myths describing humanity's creation as describing genetic engineering, with the essence of the gods being DNA mixed with earthly primates to produce modern humans. He found in Sumerian astronomical texts references to a planet beyond our known solar system, a massive world on a long elliptical orbit that periodically brings it through the inner solar system. The academic response was swift and decisive. Assyriologists pointed out that Sitchin's translations were often incorrect, that he cherry-picked texts to support his theory, while ignoring contradictory evidence, that his astronomical interpretations didn't match what the tablets actually said when properly translated. Astronomers noted that a planet with the orbit Sitchin described would be gravitationally unstable, would have been detected by modern telescopes, couldn't support life in an orbit that alternated between deep space and close solar approach. The scientific consensus was clear. Sitchin's theory was pseudoscience, unsupported speculation dressed up as scholarship. But here's what makes the Sitchin phenomenon interesting. He tapped into something real. The questions he raised, even if his answers were wrong, pointed to genuine puzzles in the archaeological record. Civilization did appear suddenly in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians did possess astronomical knowledge that seems advanced for their time. The tablets do consistently describe knowledge coming from beings who descended from the sky. Academic dismissal of Sitchin's conclusions doesn't eliminate the mysteries that made his theories appealing. The danger of the ancient astronaut approach is that it bypasses the hard work of actual archaeology and linguistics, substituting sensational narratives for careful evidence-based research. It encourages people to see ancient humans as incapable of achievement, requiring outside intervention to accomplish what were actually remarkable human innovations. It projects modern categories, modern technology, modern cosmology backward onto texts that are describing something within their own cultural framework. When Sumerian tablets describe gods descending from heaven, we don't need to interpret that as spacecraft. The Sumerians had a cosmology, a way of understanding the universe, and they described their experiences using that framework. But at the same time, complete dismissal risks missing something important. The Sumerians believed their civilization came from beings who descended from the sky. They preserved that belief across millennia. They encoded it in their foundational texts, their king lists, their creation myths, their temple rituals. They didn't consider it metaphor or poetry. They presented it as history, as actual events that had occurred. Whether you interpret descended from heaven, literally or symbolically, whether you imagine extraterrestrial visitors or advanced pre-existing human cultures, or purely mythological constructs, the core question remains. What were the Sumerians trying to tell us about their origins? And why was that origin story so important to them that they preserved it with such consistency across 3,000 years of civilization? Here's something crucial that gets lost in popularizations. Ancient Sumerian is extraordinarily difficult to translate with certainty. Many cuneiform signs have multiple possible meanings. Context can shift interpretation dramatically. Words that clearly refer to something specific in Sumerian have no exact equivalent in English. When a tablet describes the Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came, we're making choices in that translation. Heaven could mean sky, could mean space, could mean the realm of the gods conceptualized as above. Came could mean descended, could mean arrived, could mean were sent. Modern scholars are more cautious than earlier translators, more aware of how easy it is to project contemporary ideas onto ancient texts. But the mystery remains, even in the most conservative translations, even when scholars bend over backward to read these texts as purely mythological. The Sumerians consistently describe their knowledge and civilization as gifts from beings who came from the sky. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, unrelated to any other known language family. It's not Indo-European, not Semitic, not related to any modern or ancient language we can trace. This isolation makes translation challenging because we can't use comparative linguistics, can't check Sumerian meanings against related languages, can't trace word evolution through language families. Every Sumerian word's meaning must be determined from context, from how it's used in various tablets, from associated signs and phrases. And many words appear too rarely for clear contextual determination. We think we know what they mean, but uncertainty remains. Cuneiform itself adds complexity. The signs are polyphonic, meaning one sign can represent multiple sounds or multiple words. The sign for heaven or sky is En, but En can also mean God, can function as a name prefix indicating divinity, can serve as determinative helping readers interpret other signs. When you see En in a text, you have to determine from context which meaning applies, and contexts aren't always clear, especially in damaged tablets, fragmentary texts, or passages dealing with complex theological concepts. Then there's the problem of cultural context. When Sumerian texts describe the Abzu, they're referencing a concept embedded in Mesopotamian cosmology, a word that carries associations and meanings that any Sumerian reader would understand implicitly, but that we have to reconstruct from scattered references across hundreds of texts. Does Abzu mean the underground freshwater aquifer, the cosmic ocean surrounding the world, the realm where Enki dwells, or all of these simultaneously in ways Sumerian thought didn't separate? Our translations have to choose, have to render the multi-layered Sumerian concept into English words that don't quite capture the full meaning. Early translators, working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, often approach Sumerian texts with assumptions shaped by their own cultural backgrounds. Biblical parallels influenced interpretation. Victorian sensibilities affected which readings seemed plausible. Technical terminology from contemporary science crept into translations. More recent scholarship has tried to correct these biases, producing more conservative translations that resist overinterpretation. But even conservative translations involve choices. Consider the phrase Lugal Ankie, which appears in royal titles. It's typically translated King of the Universe, or King of Heaven and Earth. En is heaven, Ki is earth, Lugal is king. But the grammar is ambiguous. Does it mean the king rules over both heaven and earth? Does it mean the king is appointed by both divine and earthly authority? Does it mean the king connects heaven and earth, serves as intermediary? All these interpretations are linguistically defensible. The choice affects how we understand Sumerian concepts of kingship, divine authority, the relationship between gods and rulers, or consider descriptions of the Anunnaki themselves. When tablets describe them as powerful or great, the Sumerian words carry connotations that powerful and great don't fully capture in English. The same words used for the Anunnaki appear in descriptions of storms, of mountains, of cosmic forces, suggesting magnitude beyond human scale. But how much weight should we give these connotations? Are they emphasizing superhuman power, or are they simply standard honorific language inflated through poetic convention? The honest answer is that we can't always be certain. We can make educated guesses, can use our growing understanding of Sumerian grammar and vocabulary, can compare multiple texts to see how words are used in different contexts. But uncertainty remains built into the translation process, and that uncertainty means we should be humble about our interpretations, cautious about claiming to know exactly what the Sumerians meant, aware that our translations are provisional approximations rather than perfect renderings of ancient thought. The tablets preserve something certainly, but exactly what they're saying about the origins of civilization, about the nature of the Anunnaki, about whether descent from heaven is literal or metaphorical, remains open to interpretation even as the core narrative stays consistent across every translation. Knowledge came from above. Civilization was taught rather than slowly developed. Beings from the divine realm brought the arts of life to humanity. If you ask contemporary archaeologists and Assyriologists about ancient astronaut theories, most will dismiss them with varying degrees of patience. The professional consensus is clear. Sumerian civilization developed through normal human processes, building on earlier Ubaid culture, developing agriculture and writing through innovation and necessity, creating religious mythologies that reflected their understanding of natural forces and human psychology. The gods were metaphors. The cosmic geography was poetry. The astronomical knowledge was gained through patient observation over generations. And this is important. The evidence supports gradual development when you look at the full archaeological record, not just the dramatic discoveries of temples and tablets. But here's what the dismissal sometimes misses. There are genuine anomalies in the Sumerian record, real questions about the speed of certain developments, actual puzzles in the texts themselves that don't have comfortable explanations yet. The archaeological evidence for gradual development is substantial. The Ubaid culture, which preceded the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia, shows clear precursors to later Sumerian developments. Ubaid settlements, dating from 6500 to 3800 BCE, already practiced irrigation agriculture, built temples, produced pottery using advanced techniques. The transition from Ubaid to Uruk period wasn't sudden rupture but cultural evolution, with innovations building on existing foundations. Writing emerged from earlier token systems used for accounting. Temple architecture developed from simpler shrines. Urban planning evolved from village organization. Each development has archaeological context, shows progression, fits models of how human cultures innovate and grow. Modern Assyriologists can trace the development of Sumerian religion, showing how individual gods emerge from earlier nature worship, how theological concepts became more complex over time, how myths evolved through retelling. The Anunnaki themselves weren't static concept but developed through Mesopotamian history, their roles and attributes shifting as culture changed. What appears as sudden appearance of complete civilization is actually, in professional archaeological view, normal rate of cultural development compressed in our perception because we're looking back across 5,000 years. The astronomical knowledge can be explained through multi-generational observation. Ancient peoples across the world watch the sky carefully because it governed their agricultural cycles, their religious calendars, their navigation. Given enough time and dedicated observation, humans can discover precession, track planetary movements, predict eclipses, all without supernatural assistance or outside intervention. The Mesopotamian achievement was remarkable but not impossible, the product of intelligent, curious humans applying systematic observation over centuries. This explanation is probably correct. The weight of archaeological evidence supports it. The professional expertise of scholars who dedicate careers to understanding ancient Mesopotamia should be taken seriously. The tendency to see ancient peoples as less capable than modern humans, requiring outside help to achieve civilization, is problematic, erases human agency and achievement, projects contemporary Western biases backward onto cultures we don't fully understand. And yet, the anomalies remain. Writing does appear, suddenly, fully functional, more sophisticated than gradual development models predict. The precision of early Sumerian mathematics and astronomy does suggest knowledge sources we haven't identified. The consistency of texts describing knowledge from the sky, maintained across millennia, does indicate the Sumerians themselves believed something significant about their origins. The speed of urbanization in southern Mesopotamia was extraordinary, even by archaeological standards, compressing developments that took centuries elsewhere into just a few generations. Professional archaeology sometimes treats these anomalies as challenges requiring better evidence, gaps in the record that future excavations will fill. But the gaps have persisted despite centuries of intensive excavation. The questions haven't resolved with more data, but have become more pointed. Why does writing appear so sophisticated so quickly? Why do the earliest mathematical texts show base 60 system fully developed? Why do the Sumerians insist so consistently that their civilization came from beings who descended from heaven? Dismissing these questions as settled doesn't make them disappear. It just shifts them to margins of acceptable discourse, where they wait, unresolved, troubling the comfortable narratives we construct about human cultural evolution and the origins of civilization. Among the most startling Sumerian texts are those describing the creation of humanity, and the language used is strange enough to make even skeptical scholars pause. The myth of Enki and Ninmah describes the gods creating humans through a process that sounds less like moulding clay and more like biological engineering. Enki and the birth goddess Ninmah work together, mixing the essence of gods with clay, creating humans through a process of trial and error, producing failed attempts before achieving the desired result. The text describes genetic material, mixing of essences, deliberate design of human characteristics. Modern scholars interpret this as primitive understanding of reproduction, dressed in religious language. But the specificity is odd. The systematic approach, unlike most creation myths from other cultures that rely on divine breath or spontaneous generation. The Sumerians described creation as a technological process, complete with failed experiments and refined techniques. The tablet containing Enki and Ninmah survives in multiple copies, suggesting it was widely known and frequently taught in scribal schools. The narrative unfolds with unusual attention to process and procedure. The gods, burdened by labour, decide to create workers to take over the difficult tasks. Enki and Ninmah, the birth goddess, also known as Ninhursag, undertake the project together. They don't simply will humans into existence or breathe life into dust. They work with materials mixing the essence of a god, described in terms that suggest blood or vital fluid, with clay taken from the Abzu, the deep waters over which Enki presides. But here's where the text becomes truly strange. The creation doesn't work properly on the first attempt. Ninmah creates humans, but they're flawed, defective in various ways. One cannot hold back urine, another cannot bear children, a third cannot see, a fourth has trembling hands. The text describes these failed attempts in detail, cataloguing the defects, describing how each flawed human is still given a role in society, but acknowledging they're not the intended result. This trial and error approach is unlike creation myths from other ancient cultures, where divine acts usually succeed perfectly on the first attempt. The Sumerian account reads more like experimental protocol, systematic testing to achieve desired outcome. Then Enki takes over, refining the process, and succeeds in creating humans as intended, capable of labor, able to reproduce, possessing the characteristics needed to serve the gods' purposes. The text describes this success with satisfaction as breakthrough after failed experiments. The language emphasizes deliberate design, specific intentions, controlled process. Humans weren't accidents or spontaneous creations. They were engineered, crafted, designed for particular purpose by beings who knew what they were doing and refined their methods until achieving the desired result. Modern scholars interpret this through the lens of ancient understanding of reproduction. The Sumerians knew that human reproduction involved mixing of male and female contributions, knew that children inherited characteristics from parents, knew that sometimes births resulted in infants with defects. The creation myth, in this view, simply projects observed biological processes onto divine plane, imagining gods doing deliberately what happens naturally in human reproduction. This interpretation is reasonable, fits with how cultures often mythologize natural phenomena. But the specificity of the Sumerian account still troubles even scholars committed to conventional interpretations. Why describe failed attempts? Why emphasize trial and error? Why present creation as technological process requiring refinement rather than single perfect divine act? Most creation myths from other cultures don't include this experimental element. Egyptian myths describe gods speaking humans into existence. Greek myths have humans emerging from earth or being crafted perfectly by Prometheus. Biblical creation has God making humanity complete and functional in single act. The Sumerian version alone treats creation as a systematic project with phases, setbacks, improvements, suggesting the myth makers were trying to describe something more concrete than abstract divine will. Another text, the Atrahasis epic, adds further detail to human creation. It describes the gods killing one of their own, Wiilu, mixing his blood with clay and creating humans from this combination. The text specifies that the sacrificed god possessed personality or consciousness, TM, and this consciousness is transferred to humans through the blood, giving them intelligence and awareness. This isn't divine breath or mystical life force. It's described as specific quality transferred through biological material, essence from divine being mixed with earthly matter to produce new form of life combining characteristics of both sources. The language, even in conservative translations, sounds oddly technical for texts 5,000 years old. Terms for mixing, combining, creating deliberate results through controlled processes, vocabulary that suggests intentional manipulation rather than miraculous spontaneous creation. Whether you interpret this as ancient people describing reproduction they didn't fully understand, or as encoded memory of something stranger, the Sumerians themselves believed human origins involved deliberate creation, by beings who possessed something humans didn't have, who mixed their essence with earthly materials to produce humanity through systematic replicable process. They believed we were made, crafted, designed, not by supernatural magic, but through procedures that could be described step by step, that could fail and be corrected, that followed logic, even if the logic was divine rather than human. The Sumerians wrote extensively about a great flood that destroyed the world, and their account predates the biblical version by over 1,000 years. The Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, and sections of the Gilgamesh epic all describe a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, with one righteous man warned in advance, told to build a boat, saved along with animals and seeds to repopulate the earth afterward. For centuries, this was dismissed as pure mythology. Then archaeologists began finding evidence of massive flooding events in Mesopotamian sites, layers of water-deposited sediment separating cultural strata, suggesting catastrophic floods did occur in ancient times. But the Sumerian texts add a strange detail. The flood was deliberate, a decision made by the gods, specifically by the Anunnaki assembly, who then descended to Earth afterward to help humanity rebuild. Whether this represents actual events or symbolic memory, the Sumerians placed enormous emphasis on this moment of destruction and renewal, of divine intervention that both nearly ended humanity and then preserved it. The Eridu Genesis, the oldest version of the flood story, exists now only in fragments, but those fragments are revealing. The tablet describes the early history of humanity, the founding of the first 5 cities, including Eridu, the establishment of kingship, the growth of human population. Then something changes. The text breaks off, damaged beyond reconstruction. But when it resumes, the gods are disturbed by humanity, troubled by human noise or numbers or behavior. The Anunnaki gather in assembly to decide humanity's fate, and the decision is made. A flood will destroy the earth. But one god, Enki, opposes this decision. He chooses to preserve humanity despite the divine consensus for destruction. The text describes how Enki warns Ziusudra, a righteous king, telling him to build a massive boat and explaining the coming catastrophe. The specifications for the boat are given in detail: dimensions, construction methods, waterproofing techniques. Ziusudra is told to bring aboard seeds of all plants, breeding pairs of all animals, representatives of all human crafts and knowledge. The coming flood won't just destroy human life, but threaten to destroy civilization itself, all accumulated knowledge and culture, unless steps are taken to preserve it. The flood comes. The text describes it with terrifying intensity, water rising for 7 days and 7 nights, covering the earth, destroying everything. Even the gods, the text says, were frightened by the flood's intensity, suggesting it exceeded their intentions or their control. The Anunnaki withdrew to the highest heaven, cowering like dogs, shocked by the magnitude of destruction they had unleashed. When the waters recede, Ziusudra's boat grounds on a mountain. He releases birds to test whether land has emerged, a detail that appears in later biblical and classical flood myths, suggesting the Sumerian version influenced multiple later traditions. Ziusudra makes offerings to the gods, and they smell the sacrifice, drawn back to earth by the scent, and realize they nearly made catastrophic mistake. Without humans, who will make offerings? Who will serve the gods? Who will maintain the temples and perform the rituals? The gods need humanity, the text suggests, as much as humanity needs gods. The Gilgamesh epic version adds another crucial detail. After the flood, Ziusudra, called Utnapishtim in this version, is granted immortality by the gods. He and his wife are made like gods, given eternal life, and removed from mortal world. But before leaving, Utnapishtim tells his story to Gilgamesh, preserving the memory, ensuring future generations will know about the flood and the divine assembly that decreed it, and the single God who defied the assembly to preserve humanity. Archaeological evidence confirms that catastrophic floods did occur in ancient Mesopotamia. Excavations at Ur, at Uruk, at Shuruppak revealed flood layers, thick deposits of clay and silt separating occupation levels, evidence of water events that temporarily abandoned cities. Leonard Woolley, excavating at Ur in the 1920s, found a flood layer 3 meters deep, seemingly confirming the biblical and Sumerian accounts. More recent analysis suggests multiple flood events over millennia, regional catastrophes rather than single worldwide deluge, but disasters severe enough to have impressed themselves on cultural memory, to have seemed world-ending to those who survived them. The Sumerian texts insist the flood was deliberate divine decision, punishment or reset intended by the Anunnaki and assembly. Whether this represents actual belief that floods were divine judgment, or metaphorical understanding of natural disaster as expressing divine will, or encoding of something stranger, the emphasis the texts place on this event is remarkable. The flood wasn't just disaster, but pivot point in human history, moment when civilization nearly ended, preserved only through intervention of Enki, who defied divine consensus to save humanity and ensure knowledge would survive. The text returned to this moment again and again, treat it as crucial for understanding human origins and humanity's relationship with the divine realm, suggesting the Sumerians saw the flood as defining moment when everything nearly disappeared and the trajectory of civilization was fundamentally altered. Think about the logistics of knowledge preservation across 5,000 years, and the puzzle of Sumerian records becomes even stranger. Writing only preserves what people choose to write, what they believe important enough to press into clay and bake for permanence. The Sumerians could have recorded anything, but they chose to record again and again the same core narrative. Knowledge came from beings who descended from the sky. Civilization was a gift from the Anunnaki. The arts of life were taught by Enki. The wisdom of the heavens was transmitted from divine realm to human world. Generation after generation of scribes copied these texts, preserved these stories, treated them not as entertaining fiction, but as fundamental history. Why maintain such detailed records of mythological events unless you believed they described something real, something that actually happened, something crucial for future generations to remember? Consider the effort involved in copying cuneiform tablets. It wasn't quick or easy. Each sign required multiple precise impressions with the reed stylus held at correct angle, pressed to proper depth. A single tablet might take hours to copy, demanding concentration and skill. Scribal schools trained students for years to achieve the precision needed for accurate copying, and this was expensive, requiring resources, clay tablets, time, trained scribes whose labour could have been directed toward economic documents or administrative records. Yet Sumerian scribes dedicated enormous effort to copying mythological and religious texts. The Gilgamesh epic was copied for over a millennium, with versions found across Mesopotamia and beyond. The creation myths were copied repeatedly. The astronomical texts were preserved and updated across centuries. The king lists were maintained, extended, corrected. This preservation effort represented significant cultural investment, resources devoted to maintaining specific narratives about the past. And what they chose to preserve tells us what they considered important. They didn't just preserve random mythology. They preserved specific stories. How civilization began in Eridu, how Enki brought knowledge from the Abzu, how the Anunnaki descended from heaven, how kingship was lowered from the divine realm, how writing was a gift from gods, how the flood nearly destroyed everything, and divine intervention preserved it. These weren't entertainment. These were foundational narratives, accounts of origins that explained who the Sumerians were and where their civilization came from. The consistency across centuries is striking. Scribes copying texts in 1800 BCE preserved narratives composed 1,000 years earlier. They didn't update the content to match contemporary understanding. They faithfully reproduced ancient versions, maintaining archaic language, preserving details that might have seemed strange or irrelevant to later readers. This suggests reverence for the source material, belief that these texts contained important truth that mustn't be altered, that had to be transmitted accurately to future generations. Compare this to how other cultures handled their mythologies. Greek myths existed in multiple contradictory versions, changing with each retelling, adapted to contemporary contexts. Norse myths varied by region and era. Even biblical texts show evidence of editing and revision over time, but Sumerian core narratives about origins remained remarkably stable, suggesting they weren't treated as flexible myths, subject to creative reinterpretation, but as fixed accounts requiring accurate preservation. Why? Why this investment in preserving specific narrative about civilization descending from heaven? If it were purely mythology, entertainment, religious poetry, why the insistence on accurate copying? Why not allow creative variation, update the language, adapt to new cultural contexts? The effort suggests the Sumerians themselves believed these texts preserved crucial information, genuine history however mythologized, memory of actual events that must not be lost. Modern skeptics might say ancient peoples didn't distinguish between myth and history the way we do, that to them all traditional narratives were equally true and equally sacred. But the Sumerians did distinguish. They wrote administrative records with precision and accuracy. They recorded contemporary events in annals and chronicles. They documented legal proceedings with careful attention to facts. They clearly understood the difference between accurate record-keeping and creative storytelling. Yet they applied the same care to preserving these origin narratives as they did to preserving economic contracts and legal codes, suggesting they placed these stories in the category of important fact rather than entertaining fiction. The tablets survive today because the Sumerians made them survive. They chose what to preserve, what to copy, what to teach to new generations of scribes, and what they chose reveals what mattered to them: the narrative of knowledge descending from heaven, of civilization as gift rather than human innovation, of beings from the divine realm teaching humanity the arts of life. They wanted us to know this. They invested enormous effort across millennia to ensure we would know it. The question is why? Among the astronomical tablets recovered from Mesopotamian sites, some show configurations of stars that make you wonder what the ancient Sumerians were actually observing. Several tablets show clusters and patterns that don't match any normal night sky from Earth's surface. Some researchers have suggested these might be maps of the sky from a different vantage point, or records of unusual celestial events, or attempts to map cosmic geography beyond simple observation. The mainstream interpretation is that these are mythological star maps, imaginary cosmic landscapes used in religious ceremonies. But the precision of Sumerian astronomy in other contexts makes you pause. These were people who tracked planetary movements with mathematical accuracy, who could predict eclipses, who understood astronomical cycles that take decades to observe. If they drew strange stellar configurations, were they imagining, or were they recording something they had been told about, shown, taught by the beings they insisted came from the sky? Most astronomical tablets show configurations we can verify, star patterns that match the actual sky, as observed from Mesopotamia at various dates. The Mulla-Pin tablets, the planetary observation texts, the eclipse prediction tables, all describe celestial phenomena that astronomers can confirm, that match what ancient observers would have seen looking up from the plains between the Tigris and Euphrates. These tablets demonstrate the Sumerians and their Babylonian successors were careful empirical observers, recording what they actually witnessed, building astronomical knowledge through patient accumulation of accurate data. But a handful of tablets show something different. Star patterns that don't quite match the observable sky, configurations where distances between stars are wrong, or relative positions don't align with any actual constellation, or the number of stars in a cluster doesn't match reality. These anomalous tablets have puzzled archaeoastronomers, scholars who specialize in ancient astronomical knowledge, because they appear amid otherwise accurate records produced by scribes who clearly knew how to observe and record celestial phenomena correctly. One interpretation is that these represent mythological star maps, celestial geography from religious texts rather than observational astronomy. The Sumerians believed certain gods dwelt in specific regions of heaven, that the sky had geography as real as earthly landscape. Perhaps these anomalous tablets map divine realms rather than actual sky, showing the heavens as religious imagination conceived them rather than as eyes observed them. This interpretation fits with known Mesopotamian practice of mixing religious and scientific content, using astronomy for both practical calendar keeping and religious divination. But some researchers have suggested stranger possibilities. What if these tablets record the sky as seen from somewhere other than Earth's surface? If beings actually descended from space, as the texts claim, they would have seen stellar configurations that don't match Earth-based observation. Stars that appear close together from Earth might be widely separated from another vantage point. Constellations would look completely different. If the Anunnaki taught astronomy to Sumerians, might they have included information about the sky as they had seen it, from wherever they originated? This speculation ventures into territory most professional archaeoastronomers avoid, but the question has logical basis. If we take seriously the Sumerian claim that astronomical knowledge was taught by beings from the sky, and if those beings actually came from somewhere beyond Earth, they would possess astronomical knowledge reflecting their origin point. They might describe stellar configurations, planetary arrangements, cosmic geography that don't match terrestrial observation, because they're accurate from different perspective. The mainstream explanation remains more prosaic and probably correct. These anomalous tablets represent artistic or religious interpretations, imaginary star maps used in rituals, or simply errors accumulated through repeated copying of damaged source material. Ancient scribes weren't infallible. Copying mistakes happened. Damaged tablets might be reconstructed incorrectly. Religious imagination influenced astronomical records. All these mundane explanations are more probable than speculation about extraterrestrial viewpoints. Yet the anomalies persist in the record. Tablets that don't quite fit, star patterns that don't quite match, configurations that make researchers pause and wonder what the ancient astronomers were actually trying to depict. And given the precision of Sumerian astronomy in other contexts, given their demonstrated ability to observe and record celestial phenomena accurately, the presence of these anomalous tablets suggests something was being recorded deliberately, for reasons we don't fully understand, showing sky as it appeared to someone, even if that someone wasn't standing on Earth's surface looking up from Mesopotamian plains. And so we return to the fundamental question that archaeology can describe but not quite answer. What were the Sumerians actually trying to tell us? When they wrote that kingship descended from heaven, when they described the Anunnaki coming down to Earth, when they credited Enki with teaching civilization as if it were a transfer of information rather than a slow evolution, were they speaking metaphorically, mythologically, religiously? Or were they, in the only language and concepts they had available, trying to describe something that really happened, something they witnessed or inherited memory of, something that changed the trajectory of human development? The tablets sit in museums, 4,500 years of baked clay covered in wedge-shaped marks. The translations continue, more careful now, more nuanced, revealing complexities earlier scholars missed, and the mystery deepens rather than resolves, because the more we understand about Sumerian culture, the more sophisticated their knowledge appears, the more deliberately they preserve these specific stories of contact, of teaching, of descent from the sky. Walk through the British Museum, through the Oriental Institute in Chicago, through the Louvre, through the archaeological museums of Iraq and Syria and Turkey, and you'll see them. Fragments of baked clay, tablets covered in wedge-shaped impressions, some perfectly preserved, others damaged, broken, missing crucial passages. Each tablet was pressed by human hands 5,000 years ago, by scribes who learned their craft through years of training, who copied texts they considered important, who chose what to preserve and what to let fade into silence. And what they chose to preserve again and again was this story. Civilization came from the sky. Knowledge was taught by beings who descended from divine realm. The Anunnaki brought the arts of life. Enki rose from the Abzu bearing wisdom. Writing was a gift from heaven. Kingship was lowered from above. The me, all those fundamental principles that make civilization possible, existed before humanity and were transferred to human hands through deliberate act of teaching. Every text, every king list, every creation myth, every astronomical tablet that attributes knowledge to divine instruction, every temple inscription praising gods who taught humanity how to build and farm and write, all of it preserves this core narrative. Modern archaeology offers explanations. Human innovation, slow cultural development, gradual accumulation of knowledge through trial and error, mythological narratives that attribute human achievements to gods because ancient peoples didn't understand natural processes, religious imagination projecting meaning onto cosmic forces. These explanations are probably correct. The weight of evidence supports them. Professional consensus among scholars who dedicate careers to understanding ancient Mesopotamia shouldn't be dismissed lightly. But the mystery doesn't resolve. The questions remain. Why does writing appear so suddenly, so sophisticated? Why does astronomical knowledge seem inherited rather than slowly discovered? Why do mathematical systems appear complete from the beginning? Why do the texts insist with such consistency across so many centuries that knowledge descended from heaven? Why did the Sumerians invest such effort in preserving this specific narrative? Perhaps they were simply ancient people creating mythology, doing what humans do, telling stories about origins, giving sacred meaning to cultural achievements. Perhaps the consistency reflects how deeply these myths were embedded in Sumerian identity, how fundamental these narratives were to understanding themselves. Perhaps the sophistication of their knowledge reflects human capability operating at peak potential, showing what humans can achieve without outside intervention when conditions are right, and cultures dedicate themselves to observation and learning. Or perhaps the Sumerians were trying to tell us something, preserving memory in the only form available to them, describing encounters or events or transmissions of knowledge using the vocabulary of gods and heaven, because they had no other language for what they experienced or remembered. Perhaps descended from heaven meant exactly what it said, and we've spent centuries explaining away literal descriptions as obvious metaphors because we can't imagine what literal interpretation would mean. The tablets offer no final answers. They preserve questions, narratives, claims that 5,000 years later we still can't definitively confirm or dismiss. They sit in museum cases, these fragments of baked clay, holding wedge-shaped marks pressed by hands long turned to dust, preserving stories about beings who came from the sky to teach humanity civilization, and we still can't say with certainty whether those stories describe mythology or memory, metaphor or history, religious imagination or something that actually happened in the deep past when writing was being invented and cities were first being built and humans were becoming for the first time fully civilized. The mystery endures, patient as stone, waiting in cuneiform marks pressed into clay, holding its secrets close, refusing to resolve into comfortable certainty, keeping us wondering what the Sumerians really saw, what they really knew, what they were really trying to preserve for future generations who would discover their tablets buried in desert sand and struggle to understand what those ancient scribes were trying so desperately to tell us. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere between dream and history, consider those ancient scribes in Eridu and Ur and Uruk, sitting in temple chambers lit by oil lamps, pressing reed styluses into wet clay, marking wedge-shaped impressions that would survive 5,000 years to reach your ears across the vast gulf of time. They believed they were preserving something essential, something future generations would need to know. They believed civilization came from the sky, taught by beings who descended to walk among humans, who brought knowledge from divine realm to earthly existence. Whether they were recording mythology or memory, metaphor or actual history, they preserved it with reverence, with precision, with dedication that speaks across millennia. You're connected to them now, in this moment, listening to their words translated and spoken, considering their mysteries, wondering what they saw and what they knew. The same stars they track with such intensity still wheel overhead. The same questions they asked about origins and knowledge and the nature of humanity still trouble us. The same clay tablets they pressed still rest in museum cases, patient and silent, holding their wedge-shaped secrets, waiting for someone to understand fully what they were trying so desperately to say. Perhaps we'll never know with certainty. Perhaps the mystery is meant to endure, to pull at us across the ages, to remind us that human history contains depths we haven't fully explored, moments of transformation we don't entirely understand, knowledge that appeared from somewhere we can't quite trace. The Sumerians looked up at the night sky and saw the realm from which wisdom descended. We look up at the same sky and see different meanings, different mysteries. But the wonder remains constant, the human need to understand where we came from and how we became who we are. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same stars they mapped with such careful attention. Let the mystery rest gently in your mind, neither solved nor abandoned, just present, like the tablets themselves, like the ruins of Eridu beneath the Iraqi sand, like all the buried cities waiting patiently to tell their stories when we're ready to listen. The ancient world is still here, still speaking, still reaching across time to touch us with its questions and its wonders. Rest now. The tablets will still be there when you wake. The mystery will wait. Sleep well.